here in the financial statements of the department on the balance sheet, or presumably in the whole of government accounts or in the national accounts. Hang on, haven't I said that once before? The government say this is not a subsidy, because if it was, there's clearly a problem with EU legislation and they'd have to account for it. It is a guarantee. What concerns me is not the policy decision. It seems to me this might be a very sensible policy decision to use these mechanisms to get nuclear power stations built to protect energy production. What concerns me is the danger that these obligations are not actually made transparent in financial statements or in the national accounts. Potentially, we're in a position where there are no obligations that are going to be reflected. So we come back to the point about implications for accountability. Also, the point I mentioned at the start about contracting decisions. If this is the only way that power stations and other energy is going to be contracted, if this is the only game in town, that also leads to me to believe there's a danger that there's poor contracting about to start again, just like there was with PFI. If it's the only game in town, what other alternative is there than to follow these schemes through, almost whatever the costs? So, a few concluding thoughts. The early history of PFI accounting tells us that we cannot rely on voluntary disclosures about OOBs, either in the public sector or the private sector. The current IFRS IPSAS regime has ended the OOBs treatment of PFI schemes. So I think that's a route that's now closed, although there might be other PPP schemes that are not caught because of the limited scope of IFRIC 12 and IPSAS 32. New OOBs from guarantees and similar may result in inadequate accountability in whole of government accounts, in resource budgets, in national accounts, and poor contracting, particularly if it becomes the only game in town. A few references, if you want to follow any of those up. Thanks for listening, if you were.
Okay, good morning, and many thanks to Carla for her introduction. Of course, we are very thankful to ACCA for inviting us to this year's International Public Sector Conference. So I had the honor to attend last year's one, and I think I explained the background of the work that the European Commission and Eurostat we have been doing on developing European public sector accounting standards. And therefore, I think that I could take this up where I left this last year and give, so to speak, an update of what has happened since then. Just a few words, nevertheless, back on the study on the suitability of IPSAS for the purposes of EU member states that was released earlier in the year. Then a few words on the IPSAS conference that we organized in Brussels in May, and I see that some of us have been there. And then I would like to spend a few minutes then to explain the next steps that we are planning on the IPSAS project. So this is an overview of the work that we did when we assessed the suitability of IPSAS for EU purposes. And as we know, at the beginning there was the requirement of the so-called Budgetary Frameworks Directive, that the European Commission should assess the suitability of IPSAS for the purposes of EU member states. And this was, let's say, just one piece of three quite important requirements that they were put forward via the Budgetary Frameworks Directive. The first one was that member states should implement public sector accounting systems which generate the accruals data that are necessary for ESA purposes, and in particular for the excessive deficit procedure. This doesn't mean that these public sector accounting standards are necessarily accruals-based themselves, but they should generate the accruals data. And the second one was that all these accounting systems should be subject to internal control and independent audit, plus then the request to assess the suitability of IPSASs. So what we did was that, first of all, we ran a public consultation on the very question. Then we launched a task force with experts from our member states. And then we contracted also a study on public sector accounting and audited practices that was carried out by Ernst & Young. Okay, and then we put together all this information, and we assessed indeed in a report we put forward to the European Commission the suitability of the international public sector accounting standards for the purposes of EU policy making, and in particular for fiscal and budgetary coordination and surveillance. And then around March this year, the Commission then released this report that was forwarded to the European Parliament and the Council. So, four key messages, I think, from our study on IPSAS. The first one is that although IPSASs are not really suitable for direct implementation in all EU member states, nevertheless, they are suitable as a reference for developing European public sector accounting standards. This was the very idea. And these European public sector accounting standards should be based on a strong EU governance, and some of them may need to be adapted to the specific needs of EU member states. Costs are significant, however, would depend on the degree to which member states have already implemented accrual reforms in the areas of responsibility. And finally, we also proposed, so to speak, IPSASs light for small public entities or less risky public entities, and this is something that is going to be discussed further. So this was the IPSAS conference in Brussels, and our Commissioner Šemeta opening the conference, and quite prominent people sitting at the panel. So then I think this was, from our point of view, a very successful exercise, because although it was relatively at short notice, we managed to get more than 200 participants, public sector standard setters and accountants, high-level speakers, including President Van Rompuy, Commissioner Šemeta, of course our Director General, and of the President of the European Court of Auditors, Victor Caldeira.